My mother died on a Tuesday. The kind of overcast, sullen morning that made it hard to tell where the sky ended and the grief began. She passed quietly in her sleep, a blessing the hospice nurse whispered like a secret, as though it were supposed to make the loss softer, cleaner. But when you're the one who sat beside her for 6 months, feeding her soup, changing sheets, holding her hand through every labored breath, clean isn't the word you think of. You think of exhaustion. You think of relief. And then you feel guilty for both. The funeral was held 3 days later in the chapel downtown. Stained glass. White lilies. Everyone dressed in the kind of somber black that felt more performative than respectful. My brother James flew in from D.C., wearing the same expensive coat he wore to everything important, but uncomfortable. My sister Caroline arrived an hour late, sunglasses still on as she breezed past me to the front row. Neither had called in months. But there they were, front and center, arm in arm like we were one big grieving family. I sat alone, 3 rows back. Not because there wasn't space. Because I was tired of pretending. The service was standard. Eulogy, hymns, awkward sniffles. I spoke, briefly, just enough to be polite, not enough to be remembered. When it was over, Caroline hugged the pastor, and James gave a handshake that looked more like a campaign gesture than a farewell. Then they turned to me. "Let's grab dinner," James said. "We should talk," Caroline added. Dinner was at the Whitmore house, our family's estate. The place we all grew up in. The place I hadn't left in over a year while I cared for our mother as her health declined. They hadn't visited once. Not when she forgot her name. Not when she screamed for her own mother in the night. Not when I held her as she asked if dying would hurt. But they came for dinner. Caroline poured wine. James carved steak. I sat at the end of the table, still in my funeral dress, still smelling like lilies. "Mom wanted us to move quickly," James said between bites. "On the will," Caroline clarified, "to avoid probate delays." I blinked. "You mean the will that's been in the safe since Dad passed?" They exchanged a glance. Actually, there was a revised version. I set my fork down. Revised. "She had it drafted 2 months ago," James said, his tone coated in executive calm. "Caroline was there when she signed it." "I was helping manage her medications," Caroline added quickly. "And neither of you thought to mention this before she died?" They didn't answer. But they didn't need to. I knew that look. The one they wore when they were about to take something from me, and convinced themselves it was justified. The next morning, we met with the family lawyer. Mr. Talbot was old school, suspenders, heavy glasses, a voice like gravel. He unfolded the will on mahogany like it was sacred scripture. "According to this document, the Whitmore house and all financial assets are to be split equally between James and Caroline." I frowned. "What about me?" "It states here," he continued, tapping the paper, "that Elise Whitmore has received her portion in the form of room, board, and caregiving reimbursement over the past year." My stomach turned. Room and board. They had reduced my year of sacrifice, grief, and unpaid labor into a line item, like I was a tenant. "That's not what she wanted," I said. "It's what she signed," Caroline replied smoothly. "While on pain medication," I snapped. Talbot raised a hand. All signatures were witnessed and notarized. Legally valid. After the meeting, James pulled me aside. "Look, Elise, this is hard for everyone. But Mom was fair." "You weren't here," I said. "You don't get to define fair." "We're following her wishes." "No," I said. "You're following your convenience." He sighed like a man who'd done his duty and didn't want a guilt trip. "You can stay in the house for another month. Then we'll need to list it." And just like that, I became a guest in my own home. That night, I sat on the porch steps, staring at the garden my mother used to tend, the rose bushes she named after us. Mine was the only one still blooming. I thought about walking away, letting them take everything, letting the house, the money, the legacy become theirs. Because that's what I was taught, to keep the peace, to sacrifice, to stay quiet. But then I remember my mother's final week, the lucid moment when she gripped my hand and whispered, "They'll twist it. Don't let them." She hadn't said what. She didn't need to. If this story is already speaking to something in you, stay with me. And if you've ever felt erased by the very people you sacrificed for, take a moment to subscribe. Because this isn't just a story about inheritance. It's about reclaiming what you're owed when silence was expected of you. That night, I opened the safe. The original will was gone. But tucked behind old tax returns, I found something else. A letter. Handwritten. Dated 7 months ago. The ink was shaky. But the words were clear. If anything happens to me, check the antique chest in the attic. Don't trust James or Caroline with the truth.
Mom.
And just like that, the game changed. They thought they buried the past. But Mom left me the shovel. The attic hadn't been touched in years. It smelled like cedar, dust, and memory, the kind of scent you could almost taste. I climbed the narrow stairs alone, flashlight in one hand, the other tracing the faded floral wallpaper that peeled with every humid summer. At the top, I found an old mahogany chest shoved beneath a moth-eaten quilt. It wasn't locked, which somehow made it feel more ominous, like my mother had wanted it found. Inside, folders, envelopes, and a worn photo album tied with ribbon. The first envelope had my name in her handwriting. Elise, if you're reading this, it means your instincts were right. I'm sorry I didn't protect you better from them. But now you need to finish what I couldn't. Below the note, she listed dates, account numbers, a lawyer's name I didn't recognize, and then one chilling sentence. The revised will is a lie. I spent the next 3 hours on the attic floor, piecing together the contents of that chest like a jigsaw puzzle of betrayal. There were bank statements from nearly a decade ago, showing quiet withdrawals from my father's trust fund, each signed off by James using power of attorney while my mother was still grieving. Next, old emails printed out and highlighted. Caroline forwarding real estate listings, luxury condos in Aspen, a villa in Tuscany, with notes like, "She'll be gone soon anyway." And at the bottom, buried beneath years of dust, a signed version of the original will, dated before my mother ever got sick. This one was different. In it, the estate was to be divided 3 ways. Equally. No mention of room and board. No deduction for caregiving. Just fairness. And 3 signatures. Hers, Mr. Talbot's, and a second witness, the housekeeper Ruth. I felt sick. Not from shock. From confirmation. The next morning, I drove 2 hours north to the return address scribbled beside the lawyer's name in Mom's note. It was a small office. Unassuming. The kind of place you'd overlook if you weren't looking for justice disguised in modesty. I walked in holding the chest's contents in a canvas bag. "Are you Ms. Elise Whitmore?" the receptionist asked. "I am." She led me into a sunlit office where a man in his 60s stood, already holding a file with my name on it. "I've been expecting you," he said. His name was Arthur Lane, estate attorney, retired from big law, now practicing in selective circles. "Your mother retained me in secret," he explained, "after your siblings brought a second attorney into the fold, one she didn't trust." "Why didn't she tell me?" "She said she didn't want you burdened unless you had to be." Then he handed me a USB drive. "This contains a digital copy of the will she signed with me. It matches the one you found, which, for the record, predates the revision filed by your siblings." "So, what happens now?" He sat back in his chair. "Now, Elise, you challenge it." I'd never filed a legal motion before, but Arthur helped. Walked me through everything, filing deadlines, probate court protocols, even securing a deposition from Ruth, our old housekeeper, who confirmed she'd witnessed the real signing.
I didn't tell James or Caroline. Not yet.
I wanted them to feel safe in their fraud just long enough for it to sting. 2 weeks later, a notice arrived at the Whitmore house. Certified mail. Formal tone. The kind of letter that ruins brunch. I was making tea when James walked in holding it, pale and blinking like someone just shook him awake mid-dream. "You contested the will?" I looked up calmly.
"No."
I corrected it. "You had no right." She gave me every right. I pulled out the original will, the notarized version, Ruth's signed affidavit, the note from her mother. The email trail showing Caroline planning to liquidate my portion before the funeral. James didn't speak. Caroline appeared in the doorway, wild-eyed and furious. You were supposed to stay quiet. You were supposed to be family.
We didn't yell.
There was no dramatic confrontation or glass-smashing finale. Just three people staring across a chasm made of lies, and only one of us standing on solid ground. The court date was set. Caroline tried to delay it with emotion claiming emotional distress.
Denied.
James hired a new lawyer, one who flinched when I handed over the evidence packet labeled fraud and coercion. See Exhibit B. I sat across from them both in probate court. No makeup. No theatrics. Just the facts. Ruth testified via Zoom. Calm, clear, tearful. Arthur presented the timeline. Every signature. Every inconsistency in the revised document, down to the forged notary seal. The judge took one look at the pile of evidence and said the words I'll never forget. The amended will is hereby nullified. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cry. I just exhaled for the first time in months. When I returned home, I stood alone in the front hallway of the Whitmore house. The air felt different. Lighter. Almost kind. I made a cup of tea, sat in Mom's old reading chair, and opened the photo album from the attic chest. There, tucked between birthday snapshots and Polaroids from old beach trips, was a note I hadn't seen before. You were always the keeper of truth, Elise. That's why I trusted you. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just present. You were present. Always. If this story is landing somewhere in your chest, if you've ever been pushed aside by the very people who owed you more, know this. You are not alone. And you're not crazy for remembering every sacrifice they conveniently forgot. If you haven't already, subscribe. Because these stories, the ones we're never meant to tell, matter more than most people want to admit. And drop a comment. Have you ever been the only one who stayed and still got left out? Victory is quieter than you think. It doesn't arrive with applause or a cinematic music swell. It settles like mist slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you realize you're breathing differently. And for the first time in months, I could breathe. But peace? Peace was still under construction. The Whitmore house was mine again, legally, fully, without dispute. But it didn't feel like a win. It felt like a recovery room. Each hallway echoed with memory. My mother's voice, my father's laughter, and more recently, silence. The weapon my siblings used so effectively. James and Caroline had gone dark. No calls. No emails. Just silence. The same kind they had mastered in childhood when blame had to land somewhere, and I was the easiest target. The first morning I woke up in the house alone, truly alone, as its rightful heir, I made coffee and walked barefoot into the study. It smelled like leather and old books and autumn. My father's space. And maybe, without meaning to, I was searching for him. He'd passed 5 years before. A heart attack on a golf trip. Sudden. Brutal. The kind of loss that guts a family or exposes what was already rotting beneath. He was never the warmest man, but he'd been structured. Predictable. Calculated in the way he showed love, mostly through provision. But that morning, I opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet and found something that unraveled what I thought I knew. A thick envelope labeled, "Trust Revision, do not disclose without legal counsel." Dated, 6 weeks before his death. Inside, a copy of the original Whitmore Trust. Handwritten notes in his margin script. A draft amendment that had never been filed. The amendment changed everything. It stripped James of financial power of attorney. It outlined a staggered distribution of assets, not just based on age or title, but on consistency of presence and contribution to family responsibilities. And next to Caroline's name, a simple underline and note. Watch her spending. Impulse is her currency. But the part that made my stomach clench? Next to my name. She's always here. Don't let them erase her. He had known. Even then. Even before the sickness, before the lawsuits, before the lies, he had seen what was coming. But this amendment was never filed, never notarized, never made real, because 6 weeks later, he died. And someone made sure it never surfaced. I called Arthur Lane the same afternoon. "What do you make of this?" I asked, scanning the document to him. He called back within an hour. "This isn't just a draft. It's a directive. If we can prove it was intentionally withheld or destroyed, we're looking at more than mismanagement. We're looking at fraudulent concealment." "You think James or Caroline knew?" "I think one of them did. But I also think someone else helped them." That night, I went through the security logs. The Whitmore house had digital door access, updated just before my father died. All entries were logged. I pulled up the system on my laptop, tracing entries backward. 3 nights before his death, at 2:13 a.m., someone entered the house using the master code. Someone who wasn't me. I stared at the name in the access report. Marcus Everett. Our family's financial advisor. The man who handled all the paperwork. The man who James insisted we keep even after Dad passed. The man who suddenly stopped returning my calls last year when I asked for trust statements. He had access. He had motive. He had silence. The next morning, I walked into Everett and Associates without an appointment. The receptionist smiled too brightly. "He's unavailable today. Tell him it's Elise Whitmore," I said. "And I'm not leaving without answers." That did the trick. 5 minutes later, I was seated in Marcus Everett's corner office, staring at the man who had managed my family's legacy and possibly dismantled it. He looked older than I remembered. More nervous. "Elise," he said, smoothing his tie. "This is unexpected. Not nearly as unexpected as finding your name in the door logs 3 days before my father died."
He didn't speak.
So I slid the trust amendment across the desk. "Why wasn't this filed?" "Your father was under stress. He hadn't finalized his decision. But he'd signed it. There was no notary. You were a notary." Silence. I leaned forward. "Did James pay you to bury this?" His eyes flickered. "I did what I thought was in the best interest of the family." "You mean their interest?" I left the office with more than a theory. I left with leverage. Because buried at the bottom of Marcus's file drawer, the one he forgot to lock, was a billing record. A visit. A signature. A notary log. He had witnessed my father's amendment. He had just never filed it. By sunset, Arthur Lane had drafted the next petition. This time, fraudulent concealment of estate documents. Civil suit against Marcus Everett. Reopening of the Whitmore Trust for amendment validation. And the best part? The statute of limitations hadn't expired. That night, I stood in the hallway outside my father's study. The house was still. My hand hovered over the light switch, and I whispered to the dark. "I found it. I'm making it right." No one answered. But somehow I felt heard. To those still reading, this story isn't just about money or legal battles. It's about being unseen in plain sight. And what happens when you stop asking for fairness and document the truth instead. Subscribe if this resonates. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you uncovered a betrayal years after it was buried? Because sometimes justice isn't about catching the lie in the act. Sometimes it's about proving you were right all along. By the time the lawsuit against Marcus Everett was filed, the temperature in our family dynamic had dropped below freezing. I hadn't heard from James or Caroline since the petition notice landed on their doorstep. But I didn't need to. The silence was its own admission of guilt. Arthur Lane called me that morning. "They're lawyering up." That's a good sign. Good how? It means they know we have them cornered. We weren't just challenging a will anymore. We were challenging a system of manipulation that had spanned 5 years, maybe longer, and involved multiple players, my siblings, the advisor they trusted, and a quiet chain of legal blind eyes.
But now?
Now the paper trail was undeniable. That afternoon, I returned to the Whitmore house with 2 things in hand. A court order granting temporary injunction on all remaining estate assets. A certified copy of my father's trust amendment, now legally validated. It was time to confront the architects of my erasure. I didn't text or call. I knew they'd be home. They were always close when there was power at stake. James opened the door. He looked exhausted. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by a faint undercurrent of panic, wearing a button-up shirt. "We need to talk," I said. You've made your point, Elise. Oh no, I replied, stepping inside. We haven't even started the conversation. Caroline stood in the foyer. She was barefoot, hair pulled back, wine glass in hand at 2 p.m., not out of decadence, but out of resignation. You're destroying the family, she said. No, I said, holding out the documents. You did that when you forged Mom's will and buried Dad's. I dropped the trust amendment on the table. He named me. He saw it coming. And you, both of you, made sure no one else did. James stared at the papers like they might catch fire. Caroline scoffed. He never finalized that, Marcus said. Marcus lied. And I have the notarized log from his own office to prove it. Her face fell. I could see it in their eyes. The collapse. The silent, dawning realization that the game was no longer theirs. They had built an empire on inheritance, but they forgot the one rule that matters most in war. Don't underestimate the quiet one. James sat down, hands pressed together. So what now? Now, I said, you're going to sign a formal settlement agreement. Elise. You will acknowledge the valid trust amendment. You will relinquish claim to the family house. And you will pay back a portion of what you took. Caroline scoffed. You think we'll just roll over? No, I said calmly. I think your attorneys read the injunction, and they'll tell you it's your best option before the fraud charges become criminal. The silence was so thick, you could have poured it into a glass. Then James leaned forward, tone bitter but clipped. You were always the martyr. No, I said, standing tall. I was the daughter who stayed. And now I'm the woman who finishes what our parents started. They didn't sign that day. But 2 days later, Arthur Lane forwarded me the signed settlement from their lawyers, notarized, filed, official. The estate was closed. The trust was honored. The Whitmore legacy was legally rewritten. I celebrated alone. Not out of loneliness, but out of choice. A quiet dinner. A single glass of wine. A moment on the back porch where the roses, especially mine, had begun to bloom again. I thought of my father, of my mother's voice in that attic note, of every hour I sat at a bedside while the rest of the world forgot to call. And I said aloud to the night air, you can rest now. I kept my promise. Days passed. I started repairing the parts of my life that had been on hold while I fought for the truth. I reached out to Ruth and paid her legal fees. I donated a portion of the settlement to the hospice team who had walked me through the end of my mother's life with grace. And then, in a moment of boldness I couldn't explain, I went to the local law college and asked to volunteer for their estate law clinic. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't victory. It's visibility. To everyone still watching this story unfold, this was never just about money. It was about memory, about legacy. About what happens when the quiet one decides not to be erased. Subscribe if you've ever had to fight for what should have been yours to begin with. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if your silence was the only thing holding their lives together? It's strange, the first time you feel like the house is truly yours. Not legally, that happened weeks ago. Not structurally. I'd slept beneath its roof every night since the dust settled. But emotionally, spiritually, that kind of ownership arrives in stillness. Mine came the day I heard nothing but birds outside the kitchen window. No echoes of old arguments. No ghost footsteps from memory. Just peace. I made tea, opened the mail, and for once, didn't brace myself for a subpoena or a legal notice. Until I opened the last envelope. It wasn't from a law office. No return address. Just a neatly folded letter and a single photocopy. The letter read, Elise, your parents weren't the only ones with secrets. I think it's time you saw the full picture. RT. My hands froze. The attached photocopy was a page from an old document. Typed. Notarized. Dated August 4th, 1987. It was a codicil. An addendum to the original Whitmore Trust. Signed by my grandfather. Before he passed. Before my parents even married. The name it referenced? Margaret T. Whitmore. My grandmother. Except the codicil wasn't about money. It was about a child. If circumstances should ever arise wherein an unacknowledged heir is made known, that child shall retain full standing under the Whitmore name, entitled to the same considerations as any direct descendant. My stomach dropped. The name beneath the clause? Helen Margaret Whitmore. Born 1960. Mother, Margaret T. Whitmore. No father listed. And scribbled in the corner of the photocopy in blue ink. This is your mother. I couldn't move. The cup of tea cooled beside me, untouched. I stared at the letter until the words lost meaning. Then I read it again. And again. Was it true? Had my mother been born out of wedlock? Was that why she was always treated like a visitor at family functions, despite being the one who held the house together? And more importantly, who was RT? I drove to the county records office the next day. The clerk found the original codicil, a legitimate filing, tucked between agricultural grant deeds and oil rights. It was real, and the address listed as witness on the document belonged to Ruth Talley. Ruth, our housekeeper. I called her that night. You know who sent it, don't you? I asked. I do, she said. And I wasn't sure when it would reach you. What does this mean? It means your mother was never just married into this family. She was the family, and no one wanted her to know. Ruth met me the next day at a quiet diner off Route 2. She slid a folder across the table. Inside, copies of letters, photos, and even a birth certificate. Helen Margaret Whitmore. Born to Margaret Whitmore at a private clinic. Ruth had been a nurse's aide there. I took care of her after delivery, she said softly. Your grandfather paid everyone off. Said she was being adopted out. But she wasn't.
No.
Margaret refused. She kept the baby. Moved away. Changed everything. But the clause was filed, out of guilt, I think. Or obligation. And my mother never knew? Not until after James was born. By then, it didn't matter. She'd built the life. But the family, the board, the trustees, they never truly accepted her. Even though she was a Whitmore. Because she was a woman. And not the right kind. I stared at the old black and white photo of my mother as a toddler in a handmade dress. And it clicked. The reason she never felt fully in. The way she fought harder for fairness, even when it didn't benefit her. The reason the house, the inheritance, always mattered more than money. It was never just a home. It was her birthright. And they tried to take it from her. I returned to the Whitmore house that evening with a new purpose. Not just to protect my mother's legacy, but to redefine it. I filed a new petition. This time not for money, but for public restoration. I wanted her name, Helen Margaret Whitmore, recorded in the official family trust history. And I had the documents to prove it. The board of trustees was furious. They called it unnecessary, emotional, a vanity project. But when I presented the codicil, notarized and recorded, even they couldn't argue. They held a vote. 6-2, it passed. Her name was restored. Her birthright acknowledged. Her legacy no longer erased. Later that week, I sat alone in the study. A new plaque had arrived, one-eyed commissioned quietly. It read, Helen Margaret Whitmore.
Daughter.
Mother. The reason I learned to speak. I placed it on the mantel, right beneath her wedding photo. And for the first time, the room felt whole. This chapter isn't for revenge. It's for truth. Because sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't theft. It's silence.
And justice?
It's not always about retribution. It's about remembering who they tried to make you forget. If this moved you, subscribe for more true-feeling fiction and emotional justice stories. And tell me, what truth did your family try to bury, and are you ready to dig it up? The final document arrived on a Tuesday, just like the day my mother died, but this time, the sky was clear. A thick envelope. Hand-delivered. Inside, an official letter from the Whitmore Trust's board confirming the amendment had been entered into the family archive. My mother's name was now listed in the lineage report. Not as an appendage, not as a footnote, but as a rightful heir. A name carved back into a stone they once pretended she didn't belong to. I stood in the garden holding that letter, surrounded by the rose bushes she'd once trimmed herself. The sun warmed my face. I smiled for the first time in weeks. But legacy isn't just about writing the past. It's about building something new. 2 months later, I launched the Helen M. Whitmore Foundation. Its mission was simple: to support women caring for aging parents while being financially vulnerable, often overlooked, underappreciated, and cut out of the very resources they help preserve. I started small: a local grant, a scholarship, a partnership with hospice volunteers. But the response was overwhelming. Emails poured in. My brother sold Mom's house behind my back. I stayed. They took everything. Thank you for naming what no one talks about. Each message echoed my story in a different voice. Each one reminded me that silence is never just personal. It's systemic. A local podcast invited me to speak. Then a law school. Then an estate planning conference. They called it a story of justice. But I called it a story of presence. Because I wasn't just a voice now. I was a witness.
To my own story.
To other stories. To the long line of people who had been told they were lucky to be included at all. I was preparing for a radio interview one morning when a message popped up. It was from James. I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to speak. One-on-one. No lawyers. Just me. If you'll allow it. My chest tightened. For months, I'd wondered what a confrontation would look like. Maybe dramatic, maybe satisfying, maybe cathartic. But this was unfamiliar.
It was humility.
We met at the cemetery. Neutral ground. I stood beneath the dogwood tree where our parents were buried, watching him approach in the same coat he wore at the funeral. Except now, it looked too heavy for his shoulders. He didn't hug me, didn't even shake my hand. Just stood a few feet away, eyes unsure. I read about the foundation, he said. I wasn't hiding it. I know, he nodded. I just didn't expect it to feel this right. Silence. He stared at the headstone. I thought I was protecting her legacy, he finally said. But I was protecting mine. I didn't want to be the son who got less. Or the one who got it wrong. You were the son who forgot who stayed, I replied. He flinched, but didn't argue. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. But I wanted to say thank you for not letting them forget her. Or you. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to yell or scoff or walk away. But instead, I looked him in the eyes and said, this family has lost enough truth already. I won't add to that by pretending I don't see the effort. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. But we stood there together a while longer, and in some strange, quiet way, we buried something old. And maybe planted something new. Later that week, I got a letter from Caroline. No return address. Just a page. You were always the one who remembered birthdays. Who made tea instead of coffee, because Mom liked it better. You never had to win. That's why you did. See, asterisk. No apology. No explanation. But a crack in the wall. And for someone like Caroline, that was its own kind of confession. I framed both letters. Not out of sentiment, but as a reminder that people only come clean when you stand too tall to be stepped over. Months passed. The foundation grew. The house became more than a place to sleep. It became a hub. A quiet refuge for stories that had been buried behind etiquette and fear. A space where truth felt like inheritance, too. And one day, I received a message that stopped me cold. Elise, would you be willing to speak at my mother's memorial? She followed your story. She said you made her feel seen. I cried. Not from grief. From gratitude. Because my mother's legacy, my story, had reached farther than I thought it ever could. If you're still with me, thank you. This isn't just a story about reclaiming a house or a will. It's about reclaiming voice, rewriting narrative, and saying, I was here. I mattered. You tried to erase me, and I rebuilt in ink you can't wash away. Subscribe if this story found you. And tell me in the comments, what legacy do you wish they hadn't buried, and are you ready to unearth it? Because inheritance isn't always money. Sometimes, it's the courage to build your name in full. It started with a letter. It ends with a bench. Not a plaque. Not a statue. Just a bench. Mahogany, weather-treated, set beneath the large oak on the west side of the Whitmore house garden. the one my mother loved. We had it installed quietly, no ribbon cutting, no speeches. Just 3 women from the foundation, a small box of white roses, and a quote carved into the wood. Presence is a form of love, too. She used to say that when I asked why she sat in silence while the rest of the family made noise, the bench became a place people naturally gravitated toward. Clients from the foundation would sit there after a long week. Volunteers would eat their lunch there, journaling. Sometimes I would find fresh flowers tucked beneath the legs, not from us, but from someone who simply understood. There's power in unmarked reverence. Power in something unspoken that still speaks. And that's how I knew. We'd done more than win. We'd changed something. By the time summer arrived, the foundation had opened its second location, a small office space attached to a legal aid nonprofit in Portland. We didn't need marble lobbies or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. We needed coffee pots, open hours, listening ears. People came. More than we expected. There were caregivers with burnout in their bones. There were daughters with hands full of medical bills and no estate plan. There were stories that echoed my own. He left everything to my brother. She said I'd understand. I didn't. I stayed. They took. And each one found room here. Because we didn't offer miracles. We offered memory. In September, I was invited to speak at a symposium in Boston, a panel on women and legal legacy. Professors, attorneys, historians. I almost said no. But something tugged at me, the quiet kind of yes that sounds like your mother humming in the kitchen when she thought no one was listening. I stood before a crowd of 300. Shared the story. Didn't glamorize it.
Didn't dramatize it.
Just told it plainly. How my mother raised 3 kids while carrying a truth she never told. How she died not knowing whether her name would ever be acknowledged. How I fought not just for a house or a bank account, but for the right to be counted. When I finished, the room stood silent. Then applause. Then a line of people, mostly women, each holding stories like bruises. That was my aunt's story. That's my sister right now. You said what I never dared say aloud. It would have been easy to end it there. The house saved. The name restored. The story told. But justice isn't a finish line. It's a rhythm. A pulse. A way of choosing to stay awake even when sleep is easier. One morning, I walked through the hallway of the house and paused outside the old linen closet. Something about the smell, cedar, old fabric, faint lavender, reminded me of a night 15 years ago when I'd found Mom sitting on the floor there, folded over an old box of baby clothes. I kept all your firsts, she whispered back then. Because someone should. That memory haunted me for weeks. Until I realized what she meant. She wasn't talking about clothes. She was talking about proof. Presence. Someone who saw her as she was, not as she was allowed to be. So I opened the closet, cleaned it out, repainted it, and turned it into a memory archive. A small room, just enough space for a reading lamp, a chair, and a wall of boxes labeled with stories. Not mine. Theirs. Stories submitted by women across the country. Real names. Real accounts. Real pain and survival. I call it the witness room. Every time someone comes to the house, a donor, a mentee, a reporter, I bring them there. Not for pity. Not for PR. But so they understand. This work didn't begin with me. It began with every woman who stayed, who carried the weight, who was forgotten, but not broken. Last week, I received a card. No return address. Just a handwritten note on thick paper. I walked past the house today. The flowers were blooming. I'm glad.
See.
Caroline. I smiled. Not because she was forgiven, but because she remembered. James calls sometimes now. Mostly updates. Small talk. An occasional apology, disguised as an anecdote. Did you know Dad once burned a turkey on purpose, so he didn't have to host the board dinner? I didn't. I laughed. Sometimes that's all healing needs. Not a declaration, but a shared memory too ridiculous not to be true. And me? I'm still here. Still working. Still walking the garden path every morning and sitting on that bench with my tea. Not because I'm clinging to the past, but because I'm writing the next page from a place the past built, brick by brick. If you've made it this far, this story is yours now too. Subscribe if you believe names matter. Comment if you've ever been written out of the story you helped write. And remember, they tried to erase her. She left the door open. I walked through it,